Picture this. You're walking through a Roman city at dawn. The marble streets glisten with dew. Statues of gods line the avenue, mute stone faces looking skyward, indifferent to the people below. But then, you hear something strange. A quiet murmuring from underground. Not the chants of a pagan ritual, but something deeper. Almost like mourning. And yet not quite. You follow the sound into a catacomb. There, under flickering torchlight, are people, young and old, men and women, eyes closed, hands lifted, tears streaming down their faces. They're whispering prayers in a language the Empire cannot understand. Words not of conquest, but of confession, of healing, of a love they say is stronger than death. Now imagine someone from our time, say, a psychologist, a philosopher, maybe even you, watching this scene. You might wonder, what were they doing? What secret did they know about the human soul that made them risk everything, their families, their jobs, their very lives, to gather in the dark and whisper to an invisible God? Here's the paradox: the ancient world was saturated with spiritual talk, gods, rituals, omens, oracles. And yet, these early Christians were seen as dangerous fools. Why? Because they spoke of something no one else dared name: a fractured self, a wounded psyche, a divine image hidden under layers of shame and desire. They didn't just claim a new theology. They claimed to see inside the human person in a way that even the philosophers of their day, Stoics, skeptics, Epicureans, had missed. They believed something was broken deep within us, but not just morally. Existentially. Psychologically. They weren't content to name sins, they wanted to name the structure of the soul itself. They didn't see humans as merely rational creatures or bundles of instincts. No. They saw the psyche as a battlefield, a sacred theater where eternal things clashed in every thought, every choice, every dream. Think about that. What if modern psychology isn't the first attempt to peer into the human soul? What if the early church, the often misunderstood mystics, martyrs, and monks, knew something we've forgotten? Something deeper than therapy, older than neuroscience, truer than cultural narratives about identity and healing? You live in a world that tells you to look within to find yourself. But what if the early church said something far more disturbing, that when you look within, what you often find is not a clear self, but a divided one? Not wholeness, but war. What if the answer isn't merely inside you, but outside, and above? And so here's the great question. What did the early Christians know about the human psyche that modern minds have overlooked? How did they understand the architecture of the soul, the fears that grip us, the guilt that stalks us, the joy we long for and the despair we cannot name? Why did they speak of sin not just as disobedience, but as disintegration, a tearing apart of the self from its true center? And how did they find, not just forgiveness, but transformation? These aren't theological footnotes. These are existential blueprints. You and I spend our lives in search of meaning, identity, peace. We read books, scroll social media, experiment with therapy, self-help, mindfulness. But still, something haunts us. A hunger nothing seems to satisfy. A loneliness nothing seems to touch. A restlessness that sleep cannot cure. Could it be that what we're really craving isn't novelty, but memory? The memory of what we were made to be. The memory of a voice we once heard. The memory of a wholeness we once knew but lost. And perhaps, just perhaps, the early church didn't merely believe in salvation, they remembered something about the soul that we have forgotten. So walk with me now. Down the steps of history. Into the minds of those who first believed. Not just to learn what they said about God, but to learn what they saw in the mirror, what they believed about you. Because in their world, the psyche was sacred. And to understand it, was to begin to heal. Try to see this. A man walks through a bustling Roman forum, surrounded by marble temples, philosophers debating under porticos, incense rising to forgotten gods. He wears a fine robe. He has wealth. He has status. He has the admiration of others. But inside, he is drowning. He is haunted by shadows only he can feel. He smiles in public, but in private, he can barely sleep. He has everything, yet he feels nothing. And every day, the silence inside him grows heavier. You know this man. Because you are this man. Because this is us. The early church looked into this psychological abyss, not with the detached curiosity of academics, but with the urgency of people fighting for their souls. They didn't merely diagnose symptoms, they named the disease. The soul has forgotten its origin. The psyche, once grounded in divine communion, has been torn from its source. And in that severance, the self fractures. Augustine of Hippo, a former rhetorician turned bishop, wrote, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Not a religious slogan. A psychological diagnosis. Restlessness, deep, existential, all-consuming, isn't just a feeling. It's the signal that something essential has been lost. Modern psychology calls it alienation, anxiety, fragmentation of identity. But the early Christians called it sin. Not sin as in moral failure alone, but sin as dislocation, as disorder, as the soul forgetting its design and the self turning inward, curved in on itself, no longer able to see the light. Thinkers like Blaise Pascal echoed this centuries later. He observed that man's greatness and wretchedness exist in tandem, that we are both majestic and miserable, both image-bearers and broken vessels. We invent wonders, yet we destroy our own families. We seek truth, yet we lie to ourselves. We long for transcendence, yet we become addicted to the trivial. Pascal insisted, the heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing of. The early church would have agreed. And this paradox of the psyche, the grandeur and the ruin, haunted every early theologian and mystic. For them, to speak of the soul was to speak of a battlefield. Thomas Aquinas would later describe the soul not as one monolithic thing, but as faculties in tension, the intellect and the will, the passions and the conscience. The mind may know what is right, but the will resists. The heart may long for the good, but the flesh resists. This inner war is not new. It did not begin with Freud. It began in Eden. The early church interpreted the fall as more than a mythic loss, it was a psychological trauma. A tearing of the soul from God and from itself. And this trauma is inherited. Not in our DNA, but in the architecture of the self. You see this in the writings of Anselm of Canterbury, who longed for a rectitude of the will that humans no longer possess. You hear it in John Calvin's insistence on total depravity, not as utter evil, but as a total distortion of every part of our nature. You read it in Kierkegaard, who wrote of despair as the sickness unto death, a self that refuses to be itself before God. And in our time, Carl Jung, who, though not a Christian, sensed this rupture. He saw the psyche as full of archetypes, wounds, and longing for integration. But unlike the early church, Jung lacked a clear axis around which the psyche could integrate. The church had that axis, the imago Dei, the image of God. That's the forgotten cornerstone. The early Christians believed that every human bears God's image. Not metaphorically, but ontologically. It's not something you feel. It's something you are. And yet that image is marred. Not destroyed, but cracked, like a mirror dropped on stone. Still capable of reflecting glory, but fragmented. Still pointing upward, but distorted. This was not mere theology, it was psychological anthropology. It explained why we self-sabotage. Why we love and fear. Why we long and hide. Why we ache for home, but run from the Father's voice. Later thinkers like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton would expand this vision. Lewis saw human desire as the echo of Eden. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, he wrote, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Chesterton called the Christian doctrine of sin the only part of Christian theology which can really be proved. Why? Because it explains the universal, daily experience of inner contradiction. And here lies the core of it. The modern mind treats the psyche as a machine or a chemistry set. But the early church treated it as a sacred ruin. Majestic in design, tragic in condition, glorious in destiny. So they didn't ask, how do I feel better? They asked, how do I become whole? And that question led them, not to comfort, but to transformation. But before we can answer it ourselves, we must first understand the full weight of what happens when this sacred design is forgotten. Close your eyes and see this. A child stands in front of a mirror, but the mirror is shattered. Every shard reflects a different image. One shows fear, another shows pride. One shows shame, another ambition. The child stares, confused. Which one is me? He whispers. But the mirror gives no answer. Only silence. And so, he grows, collecting pieces of identity, patching together masks, trying to feel whole. But something inside always feels off. Misaligned. Incomplete. This is not fantasy. This is the modern soul. What happens when the psyche forgets its divine origin? When the Church's vision of the Imago Dei is replaced with 1,000 competing narratives of self? What happens when our souls, once seen as sacred, are reduced to sensations, impulses, or neurons firing in the dark? We don't notice it at first. The shift is subtle. But slowly, society begins to redefine what it means to be human. We go from, you are made in the image of God, to, you are whatever you feel. From, you are broken but loved, to, you are perfect just as you are. From, you are meant for eternal communion, to, you are alone in a meaningless cosmos, so make the most of it. And the soul begins to fragment. Psychologically, we call it anxiety, burnout, depression. Philosophically, we call it nihilism, relativism, the loss of meaning. Spiritually, it is exile, a quiet, everyday estrangement from ourselves and from the God who made us. And it's everywhere. We see it in the epidemic of loneliness, even in a hyper-connected world. We see it in the rise of identity crises, confusion, and rage. We see it in our politics, our entertainment, our therapy sessions, even our churches. But most of all, we feel it in the mirror. The unseen consequence of a forgotten soul is this. You still crave truth, but doubt it exists. You still long for love, but fear it won't last. You still hunger for purpose, but secretly wonder if it's all an illusion. You try to reassemble yourself through achievement, romance, activism, therapy, consumption. You project confidence. You perform wellness. But underneath it all, something is quietly unraveling. The psyche, cut off from its eternal source, cannot sustain itself. No amount of positive affirmation or inner work can substitute for the loss of a unifying center. The early church fathers understood this. They taught that when the soul loses God, it doesn't become free. It becomes enslaved. Not to external oppressors, but to internal tyrants. Desire becomes addiction. Freedom becomes bondage. Autonomy becomes fragmentation. In today's terms, we call this dysregulation. Cognitive distortions. Emotional volatility. But the early church used words like disordered loves, a term first used by Augustine. He taught that sin isn't always loving the wrong thing. It's loving the right thing in the wrong order. We love career over family, pleasure over truth, self over God. And as our loves twist, so too does our identity. This is not just sin. This is psychic collapse. And the culture, well-meaning though it may be, only deepens the wound. It tells you, follow your heart. But what if your heart is confused? It tells you, be your authentic self. But what if your self is divided? It tells you, trust your truth. But what if your truth is shaped by trauma and fear? The early church never said, trust yourself. They said, die to yourself. Because only in death could the true self be reborn. And here's the most haunting part. You can go your whole life without realizing what's missing. You can succeed, create, love, and still feel like a ghost. You can build an empire, and still hear the faint whisper, this is not who you are. We think trauma is only caused by abuse. But what if the greatest trauma is amnesia, forgetting who you were created to be? Modern neuroscience hints at this. The brain is wired for meaning, for story, for connection. When those anchors are severed, we experience a quiet despair, a background anxiety we can't quite name. We distract ourselves, medicate ourselves, numb ourselves. But the ache remains. Because deep down, our soul remembers Eden. You remember Eden. You don't know why, but you remember peace. You don't know how, but you remember joy. You don't know when, but you remember home. And no career, no relationship, no philosophy can fully explain or erase that memory. It lingers, like a faint melody echoing through the corridors of your life. You try to ignore it. But it keeps playing. And maybe that's why you're here. Maybe something inside you is tired of patching up the mirror. Maybe you're ready to ask. What if the early church was right? What if the self isn't something you create, but something you receive? What if healing isn't found in expression, but in surrender? That would mean everything you've been taught about selfhood might be inverted. And that realization, if you're brave enough, could change everything. Imagine this. You've spent your whole life inside a vast mansion. Each room is filled with mirrors, all angled to reflect some version of you. One mirror shows your achievements. Another your regrets. One flatters your image, another magnifies your flaws. You move from room to room, adjusting your posture, fixing your expression, trying to find the right self. But every mirror lies, because none of them are windows. You've never seen the outside. You've never breathed the air of something real. Then one day, you hear a knock, not from within, but from beyond the walls. A voice calls your name. Not your title, not your brand, not your curated identity. Your name. And suddenly, you wonder, what if I'm not meant to live like this? That moment of wonder, terrifying and sacred, is where resistance begins. Because here's the truth the early church proclaimed, again and again, you were not made to find yourself in reflections. You were made to be found in communion. With the God who speaks your name. With the body that holds you when you can't hold yourself. With a story that is older than pain and greater than shame. But to get there, you must die. Not physically, but psychologically. You must die to the false self. This was the radical wisdom of the early church. They didn't invite people to join a religion. They invited them to undergo metanoia, a complete inner transformation. Not just belief, but rebirth. Not just a new idea, but a new identity. And that identity was not something invented. It was bestowed. It began with confession. But not the shallow, guilt-ridden kind. The kind that cracked open the hardened heart. That said, I am not who I pretend to be. I am not whole. I am not the author of my own meaning. This wasn't shame. It was truth. And in truth, there is power. Then came baptism. A symbolic burial. A drowning of the old self. And a rising into something the world could not explain. A new creation. A citizen of a kingdom not seen. A soul reintegrated. This was the church's resistance. It declared war on the false self. Not with anger, but with love. Not with slogans, but with sacred acts. They created communities where people didn't need to perform. Where identity was not based on ethnicity, achievement, gender, or class, but on grace. Where wounds could be named. Where shame could be disarmed. Where joy could rise from ashes. And how did they do it? They practiced silence. Because they knew the soul couldn't heal in noise. They embraced suffering. Because they knew pain could purify. They pursued virtue. Not to earn love, but because they were already loved. They meditated on Scripture, not as a rulebook, but as a mirror clearer than all others. They fasted, not to prove holiness, but to remind the flesh it was not in charge. They forgave, not because it was easy, but because bitterness is a poison of the soul. They lived simply, not because they hated beauty, but because they knew nothing external could define them. And they worshipped, not to escape reality, but to return to it. This was the way of healing. And make no mistake, it is resistance in every age. Because we live in a world that says, build your brand, follow your bliss, trust your impulses. But the early Christians said, lose your life, and you will find it. And they weren't being poetic. They meant it. Søren Kierkegaard wrote that the self is a relation that relates itself to itself. But without God, that relation collapses. The self becomes a loop, a hall of mirrors. Christianity, he said, is the only cure. Because only in God does the self find its true referent. James K. A. Smith echoes this today. He argues that we are not primarily thinkers, but lovers. Our identity is shaped not by what we believe, but by what we adore. And if we adore false gods, money, sex, power, self-image, we become hollow. But if we adore Christ, we become whole. This is why the early church suffered. They refused to adore Caesar. They refused to worship the empire of the self. They refused to believe the lie that we are what we feel or achieve. They knew better. They had seen resurrection. So, here's the question. Are you willing to resist? Are you willing to leave the hall of mirrors? Are you willing to lose the self you've built, to receive the self that God longs to give? Because you can't have both. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot be healed while clinging to your illusions. To be made whole, you must die and rise. And in that paradox, lies the doorway to freedom. Visualize this. You're standing in a desert at night. The stars are infinite above you, yet your chest feels hollow. You've been wandering for years, chasing mirages, success, validation, romance, control. And for a moment, one by one, all your achievements stand beside you like shadows. They whisper the things they gave you. Temporary worth. Fleeting comfort. Illusions of security. But then, they vanish. And in the stillness, you realize the most terrifying thing. You don't know who you are without them. And then you hear it, a voice. Not from within. But beyond. It calls your name. Not the name you built. The name you were given before you were born. A name spoken only by one who knew you in the beginning. A name that doesn't ask for your resume, your trauma, or your projections. Just, you. And in that moment, the truth hits like a flood. You are not the sum of your memories, mistakes, or ambitions. You are the image of the eternal. Not a product. Not a personality. Not a role. You are a soul, crafted in love, marred by sin, pursued by grace. This was the deepest truth the early church knew. Not just that God exists, but that God desires you. Not the cleaned up version of you. The real you. The shattered, hungry, beautiful you. They called it theosis, not in the pagan sense of becoming divine in essence, but in the profound Christian mystery of union with God. To be united with Christ in such a way that His life becomes yours, His righteousness covers your shame, His Spirit renews your broken places. This isn't self-improvement. This is resurrection. David Benner, a Christian psychologist, said, "The true self is the self that is open to God. Not curated, not defended, not inflated. Open. Because it's in that openness that transformation happens, not when you strive, but when you surrender." C.S. Lewis described it like this: "Your real, new self, will not come as long as you are looking for it. It will come when you are looking for him." And this is the final paradox. You do not find yourself by seeking yourself. You find yourself by losing yourself in the one who made you. This is not escapism. It's return. To the garden. To the voice. To the wholeness that was once yours, and still waits. Everything modernity tells you, be independent, build your brand, define your truth, only thickens the fog. Because the self was never meant to define itself. It was meant to be received like a gift. And gifts can't be earned. Only opened. So what did the early church know about the psyche? They knew the soul was sacred, because it was made by a sacred God. They knew sin was not just a rule-breaking, but a soul-breaking. They knew salvation wasn't an escape from the world, but a healing of the self from within. They knew that transformation didn't happen through performance, but presence. They knew that the deepest truth about you is not what you've done or what's been done to you, but who God says you are. And who are you? A mirror of the divine. A temple of the Spirit. A prodigal with a waiting Father. A soul designed for glory, even while wrapped in dust. So, what now? You could go back. Keep scrolling. Keep performing. Keep adjusting the mask. But you'll always hear the echo. You'll always feel the ache. Or you could stop. Fall to your knees, literally or metaphorically, and say, "I remember now. I remember who I am. I am not my shame. I am not my success. I am not my compulsions, my wounds, or my pride. I am yours." That's not the end of the journey. It's the beginning. The early church didn't have the vocabulary of modern psychology, but they understood the human heart better than most therapists today. Because they saw the heart not just as something to be explored, but as something to be redeemed. They knew that the psyche is not just broken, it is loved. Not just confused, but called. And that changes everything. So, whoever you are. If you're tired, let go. If you're numb, wake up. If you're angry, cry out. If you're hollow, come home. The mirror is still cracked. But the light behind you is real. And when you turn toward it, you begin to shine again. What stood out to you in this reflection? Share your thoughts in the comments, your voice matters here. Thank you for taking the time to reflect with me today. If this spoke to you, feel free to like, subscribe, and join the conversation. Until next time, stay curious. Because the examined life is still worth living.